Hey, Saretsky here. Welcome back to the show. Lots to touch on this week. I want to touch on the Vancouver presale market, the Toronto presale market, what's happening with the foreign buyer ban, the Calgary market as well. And I also want to touch on what we're seeing in the jobs market and in the bond market for those that are following mortgage rates. But I want to frame it up this week with a story. I had a journalist reach out, which happens quite often. I do talk quite a bit with the media. Those of you that are following along know that. So I had this conversation. He goes, listen, we want to talk about what's happening in the pre-construction market and how it's sort of competing with the resale market. And so I said, yeah, great. Happy to chat about that and what's happening in what we call the shadow market. And so we kind of get onto this conversation. He goes, well, tell me how they're competing. How is the resale market competing with the pre-sale market? I said, well, what do you mean? I've said they're competing because you have two products for sale that are competing with the same number of buyers. There's a buyer pool, and you have new construction condos for sale, and you have resale condos or resale inventory for sale. So they effectively compete for the same limited number of buyers. And he goes, well, how are they actually competing? How are they competing on price? As well, they're trying to compete on price, but they can't compete on price. And let me explain this in detail. That's what I was trying to get through to this journalist who just couldn't quite understand the conversation that I was trying to explain to him. Is effectively what is happening here is developers have a certain margin on projects they have to maintain. I mean, you've got limited partners, you've got bank debt, so you can't just arbitrarily drop prices like this by say 10% overnight. I mean, developers are very, very slow to move with the market because, again, that's just how the development space works. You're running a large business. You can't just cut prices, specifically if you've sold, let's say, 60 or 70% of the building. You got a whole bunch of people that are closing in a couple months. You can't just start offloading all your inventory. That would then brings appraisal prices down, creates closing issues with the 60, 70% of the buyers that already bought into the building. So there's sort of a way that the development business has to sort of operate to keep things basically, keep the lights on. So effectively what I'm saying is we've seen this large buildup in the resale market where, you've got, say, call it 7 months of inventory for sale in Greater Vancouver. In pockets like Burnaby, Surrey, you have all-time record high number of units for sale on the resale market. And so what you're seeing is, obviously, as time builds, that's pushing downwards pressure on prices. And in the new construction market, think about is there's already this premium, right? When you're buying new construction product, I mean, you probably should be paying a premium because it's brand new. Everything is brand new. You've got a home warranty. And so what we've seen, though, specifically over the last number of years, is the cost between new construction homes and resale homes that are, say, 3 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, the gap is getting larger and larger and larger. It's just widening to the point where it's very difficult to entice someone to buy a new condo. The gap's just getting too wide, especially in these markets where resale prices are adjusting much quicker. The price is gapping down quicker. It's pushing that spread even wider. And if you look at the chart that we created here showing the gap between new construction and resale continues to widen. So effectively what you might see, let's say in Vancouver, is you might see a new construction condo pre-selling for, call it 1,600 a square foot, but you've got similar resale product that's, say, 5 years old, selling at like 1,200 a foot. So you have this 400 a square foot gap that is massive. And, some people were willing to pay that gap when the market was hot and people believed prices would continue to go up. There's limited supply in the resale market. And people were willing to say, hey, you know what? In 3 or 4 years when this project's complete, maybe the price won't look that bad. It'll be, the gap will narrow. Today, you're saying, well, the gap probably isn't going to narrow. It's actually probably going to widen because the resale market continues to move lower, and the pre-sale market just simply, it can't adjust fast enough for all the reasons I just illustrated at the beginning of the show, which is to say, again, developer margins, bank financing. Yes, banks do have a say in pricing, and as well as your existing pre-sale purchasers in there. And so they're very slow to adjust pricing. And this is ultimately what's happening. This is why you're now seeing the calls from all the developers saying, listen, we got to bring the foreign buyers back into the fold. We got to let them we got to let them buy new construction condos because we're left holding the bag effectively here. And if we can't sell all of our unsold units, we're never going to launch a new product. And this is what I was trying to explain to the journalist, because he's like, well, what's your point? I said, what do you mean? What is the point? The point here is the pre-construction model itself is dying. It's effectively dying. And there's the implications of this are significant. Regardless of what side you're on, whether you're a housing bull or a housing bear, it doesn't matter. The implications are significant, from the labor market to the economy, to future housing supply, to home prices. It's all very, very fascinating. This is like the biggest story. The guy couldn't wrap his head around. I said, so, we do this 30-minute call, and he goes, yeah, I don't think this is a story here. I said, guy, this is the biggest story developing in the Canadian real estate space today by far. Look at what is happening in what we call the shadow market. Okay. You have in Greater Vancouver, you have about 13,000 unsold homes in the new construction condo space. So this is effectively developers that are sitting on a record high number of unsold units on their books, on their balance sheets. Okay, so that 13,000, to put into context, in the bull market of 21, 22, that number sort of hovered around 5,000. So you've nearly tripled the number of unsold units on developer balance sheets. And so the implications of this are significant. Basically here, what you have is a scenario where as a developer, you're going, okay, holy smokes, we have all this inventory we need to clear off our books. And if we can't sell it, I mean, you're never going to launch a new project. So think about like moving forward, if you're a developer and you have various projects on the go, and every project that is currently, let's say, under construction, you have, call it 80% of the building that is sold, you've kind of withheld, or you still have, let's say, 20% of the units that are unsold. You look at it and say, wow, well, like, we're not able to clear all of our existing inventory. We definitely aren't going to launch a new project. You're not going to start a new project and go and, spend millions of dollars and taking on additional risk if you can't clear and sell your existing inventory. And so what I'm saying too, as well, is if you now have to look at it on the resale side, the media and the real estate board reports on resale inventory. When they talk about the number of new listings that came to market and the total inventory for sale, they're talking about the resale market, because the 13,000 units that are on the developer balance sheets don't typically go on the MLS system. If you're a developer and you've got a high-rise building of 300 units and you got 75 left over, you're not going to put 75 listings on the MLS and flood the market and flood the inventory. Most developers might put on like 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 units on the MLS just to show the public, hey, listen, we still have a couple of units for sale. Come in and inquire at our presentation center. Come call our sales staff, and we'll tell you what available inventory we have. So this is the shadow market. So when we say, hey, listen, there's a lot of inventory in the resale market, listings are way up, 7 months of inventory, we're not even including the shadow market, which, as I've told you, has gone from about 5,000 in the bull market to about 13,000 unsold units. So again, the implications of this are significant. And this is why you're seeing developers panicking and saying, bring in the foreign buyers. We need some demand to kickstart. Who's going to buy these units that are currently under construction or currently pre-selling? And if we don't have people to come in, then we're going to be stuck with all this inventory, and we're definitely not going to be launching new housing projects or new housing starts in the near term future. And this is what I continue to say is, so basically the argument is, listen, government, you've been promising everybody you're going to build a record 500,000 new homes a year, which is essentially effectively double the all-time record high. But how are you going to do that if you can't get the development community to go out and build new projects? Because they can't build new projects because, again, they're sitting on all-time record high shadow inventory. So the implications, of course, are significant. We're going to be talking about future job layoffs in the construction sector. You're going to talk about future housing shortfalls, not today, not tomorrow, not 2 years from now, but probably 4, 5, 6 years from now. We'll be saying, wow, Not, nothing got built starting in 26 and 27 and 28. And then that will sort of sow the seeds for the next bull market. But that is not a year or two away. That is a conversation. I think today you're in a well supplied market as these units continue to come on the market. But this is, anyone that's been watching this channel knows this is the biggest story and the biggest conversation today is exactly what's happening in the development space. And we'll continue to be watching this. We had, ironically, part of this, which stirred up this conversation, was with the data that was released by Urbanation showing the perils that are developing not in the Vancouver housing market, but also in the GTA housing market, which is actually way worse. It's way worse in the GTA market than it is in Vancouver. And if you look at what Urbanation is posting out, they're showing that in Q2 of this year, Q2 of 2025, in the Greater Toronto housing market, you had about roughly 1,300 new condo sales for the entire quarter. That's down from peaks of nearly 12,000 units. Again, going back into 17, 18, and during the pandemic, though, we reached about roughly 10,000 units in any given quarter, now down to about 1,300. There's been a total collapse. So Urbanation says, these aren't my words, this is the Urbanation comments saying, project cancellations are mounting, construction starts are collapsing, jobs are being lost, buyers are losing a lot of money, and developers are facing difficulties with closings. Again, Urbanation on the new condo market in Toronto. And so, again, I think this is the biggest story that is developing out. And, one way I can tell you where basically what is happening is the construction model is changing. Over the last basically 20 years, we haven't been building rental housing. We've been building for sale housing, which has been funded through investors and people buying pre-construction units to fund the development and the construction of new condos. And that model is effectively dead or non-existent today. So the model to fund new housing is completely pivoting, and it's going to rental. It's going to CMHC rental housing, which is government finance, government subsidized financing for developers. They're all now pivoting and saying, nobody wants our pre-sales. We can't sell them. There's no market for the pre-sale. So let's just build purpose-built rental housing and jam it through CMHC, to the fact where I think 50% of all new construction in the market is currently rental. And, one of the markets that's benefiting a lot from this has been the Calgary market. It's a market that I'm personally involved in, so I do follow it relatively closely. And my concern is that market is it has the ability to add housing supply very, very rapidly. You have very cheap permitting, and you have very quick decision making from the city. So it's very easy place to add new housing, and the private sector reacts very, very quickly, or is able to, through government policy, is able to react very quickly to changing market conditions. So when the housing market gets hot, you have a lot of people that will immediately start putting shovels in the ground, and they can move very, very quickly. And so that Calgary market, the Alberta market in general, will tend to overbuild itself. And that's what we're seeing. And it's actually being heightened. The overbuilding is being heightened through the CMHC program, where you can see Calgary purpose-built rentals under construction. There's now 73% more purpose-built rentals under construction in Calgary than just 6 months ago. CMHC data points to roughly a 7% vacancy on newer builds already. So they just continue. Basically, what's happening in that CMHC and in that Calgary market is you have people that are taking advantage of a product. You have too much. You can have too much of a good thing. And so effectively what's happening is, through that program, if you build new housing, you hit the metrics, which are relatively easy to hit, especially in markets like Calgary, is you can get 50-year amortizations, 95% loan to cost through CMHC. So effectively, you can build this, let's say, a small apartment building or a townhouse complex, a rental complex, with, call it 5% equity, lever this thing up. And then when it's done, you just strap it with 50-year amortization, 95% loan to cost. And what a lot of people are doing, what a lot of cowboys are doing, is they're actually going in, they're inflating their pro forma, they're inflating their construction budget. The CMHC will lend on that. And effectively, the short answer is when the project is done, they don't even really have 5% equity in the project. They effectively are able to refinance almost 100% LTV, even though the project was basically won't really cash flow, or like barely, it'll just barely cash flow. But they're like, well, hey, I own this asset now. I've strapped it with long-term debt. I've got all my money out, and now I just sit on this asset and get wealthy. Where the concern is going to be is, as I talked about, you've got record number of rental housing under construction in that market. Rents are already softening, and I suspect they're going to continue to soften. They're actually probably going to come down, I think, quite a bit. And now when you have turnovers in your buildings, let's say a 2-bedroom unit might rent for $2,500. All of a sudden, the tenant leaves and it's at $2,300, and you multiply that across 20 units. That's a quick way to render yourself insolvent, or at least put yourself in very difficult financial positions, particularly when you start multiplying that across not just one building, but 3 or 4 buildings. And that's what I'm seeing on the ground. I think that's the real concern. I know CMHC is starting to get concerned there. But again, the construction space is, I think, where all the fireworks are in the housing markets across Canada today. That's where I think it's very, very fascinating, particularly when you talk about how much the government has played up and pushed during election campaigns to speed up and ramp up housing. It is going to collapse in the opposite direction. Housing starts, I continue to believe, are going to fall off dramatically. And the only thing that is keeping them even relatively elevated is the CMHC rental program. So again, keep an eye on all of this from the policy perspective. Starting to see some weakness in the labor market. We saw some job data out this week. Today, actually, they did. I'm recording, so 40,000 jobs lost in July. Everybody panicked. Don't forget, we added 80,000 jobs in June. So you kind of have the Stats Can random number generator. RBC's thoughts, not my thoughts. The data is in line with their expectations. No further Bank of Canada rate cuts based on one announcement today in the labor market. But the trend effectively is a softening labor market and a softening economy. And I suspect the construction sector is going to add to that. And I think it's going to add to it in a significant way, where there's just simply not going to be enough new projects starting for all of these construction workers to then move on to new projects. And so that is a space that I think we need to continue to watch. We're seeing some softness again in the bond yields. Canada 5-year bond yield, again, mortgage rates effectively range bound in the low 4s, 4.1, 4.2. So no real change there. But that's what we're keeping an eye on. So if you're a journalist, keep your eyes on that. Pay attention. There's a lot to keep our eyes on moving forward. As always, hope that helped. See you next week.